Tonight on Mir, this first round only took 84 minutes. Keeper lost his head. And now we need to crush more clankers. Previously on the Tales of Mir. Having magically absconded from Soros' magitech laboratory, our heroes face down Keeper atop Grund's ziggurat, the ominous red moon blazing overhead. The powerful automaton demands both an explanation and their surrender, but his words are ignored as the party, led by an enlarged Themor, assaults him with the full complement of their magic and martial prowess. In moments, Keeper lies in a dented, sparking heap at the base of the temple. In a final act of desperation, the automaton overloads its central power core in an attempt to trigger a massive reality-warping explosion, but the quick-thinking Anderos banishes him to a harmless demiplane with a surge of sorcerous power. A minute later, the lifeless head and legs of Keeper rematerialize, and the group hurries back to the beachhead to warn the others and urge them to weigh anchor and make for open water post-haste. Upon arriving, however, they learn Jerirag is under siege from a host of its own automaton creations operating under new sentience. This, combined with the sudden and unannounced disappearance of both Freya and Pestles, the group has little choice but to set a course from the magitocracy in hopes they can arrive in time to quell the robotic uprising before it can spread. Or worse. With Anderos magically propelling their ship, the glories rise northward under full press of sail. The wide, verdant expanse of Mir eventually recedes to a hazy, distant lump behind them on the horizon. By some sixth sense, Hildy realizes the magical censure preventing her from scrying on Karjit has now expired, and she quickly retreats to her cabin below decks with the Orb of Dragons clutched tightly to her chest. Peering into the ball, she focuses the artifact's powerful magics once again to seek her dwarven friend. Dark tendrils swarm across the vision, but a moment later the dwarf appears before her, tied, gagged, and groaning painfully on the splintered floor of some distant ship. Shadows cling to the very walls of the cabin like tar-covered curtains, but unfortunately Karjit seems to be alone. Determined to learn more, Hildy attempts to force the sensor to pan over the rest of the room, but suddenly feels her vision gripped by some unknown force and wrenched aside. To her horror, a burning red eye manifests before her, filling her entire field of vision. She tries to withdraw, to recoil from the terrifying specter, but its lidless malice only sears deeper into her mind. Then, in a crimson flash, the connection breaks, and Hildy slumps to the floor with a shuddering exhale, blood trickling from her nostrils, and her head throbbing from the psychic assault. Some minutes pass before Hildy can quell the pain enough to haul herself up from the floor. Grabbing a nearby rag, she wipes the blood from her face and the clammy sweat clinging to her neck, then gathers herself and shakily makes her way to the deck to speak with Anderos. The tiefling stands amid the forecastle, stoically shaping the winds to best aid their progress, but the ashen face of his companion gives him pause. Hildy swallows the lump in her throat, pushing back the horror she felt not minutes before, and explains what she had witnessed. A dark room, likely the hold of the promise, and Karjit lying there listless, confused, and in pain, surrounded by dark, oozing shadows. She then describes the awful crimson eye and its hateful glare, all leading to the connection being forcibly severed. Ruminating on this news, Anderos eventually admits he's grateful to learn Karjit is at least alive, but surmises Dietrich has likely gained more powers from Saloon since their last meeting. He requests Hildy to continue in her attempts to scry on the promise, but urges her to take what precautions she can so to protect herself. Hildy nods solemnly, and the two stand in silence for a time, watching the ship carve its way through the gently rolling swells. This sight seems to trigger lingering memories of the time together in the Altmere, and the gnome sheepishly reminds Anderos of their last fateful voyage aboard the Moonchaser when it was wrecked upon the rocks of Tempest Gambit, where only she and Barnacle survived. She admits fear of taking to water yet again, but Anderos offers a solution. He could magically compel her to a peaceful rest, and thus she might avoid any potential fits of panic which might seize her. Hildy is pleasantly surprised at the suggestion and readily accepts, and a few moments later the gnome, eyes drooping under the magical compulsion, slowly trundles down to her cabin for a night of blissfully dreamless sleep. However, the same cannot be said of the rest of the crew, as sleep proves difficult to come by that night. Plagued by nightmares of dragons roaring over starless nights, piles of bodies torn and shredded by claw and fang, of cities burning, mountains crumbling, nightmares all compelled by the cursed orb of dragons nestled safely in the arms of Hildy. As morning dawns, a fractious mood hangs over the sleep-deprived crew, and it isn't long before the last nerves are plucked and verbal scuffles ensue over routine tasks. Even Anderos finds himself struggling to maintain any semblance of discipline, so he decides to pay the still snoozing Hildy a visit, having a hunch their poor sleep was due in no small part to the Orb of Dragons. The gnome wakes to a frightful thundering on her door, and after a surly dressing down by her tiefling companion, is commanded to speak with Grund in hopes the former aspect of reason can provide a solution, ideally before the rest of the crew deduces her to be the source of their sleepless nights. At that, the captain storms off in a huff, and Hildy makes for Themor's cabin to speak with Grund, the orb safely tucked in her bag. The ever-prickly dragonborn admits surprise at the gnome's social call, but when Hildy draws forth the orb, Grund visibly recoils and demands she remove the hateful artifact from her sight. Noting her visceral reaction, Hildy quickly replaces the orb in her bag, then inquires of its history. The dragonborn, assuming offense, glowers at the gnome, but eventually explains that its origin and creator are unknown, but its purpose is unequivocal. It is the physical manifestation of mortal sins, each the antithesis of the virtues which ultimately formed the dragons aeons ago. Lowering her voice, she also divulges the theory held by some of the aspects that the orb itself is the soul of the rumored king of dragons, from which stems its great powers of compulsion and obsession over both dragon and mortal kind alike. Hildy, taken aback at this revelation, asks is there any way to cleanse the orb of these curses. With a spiteful hiss, Grund's first suggestion is to hurl the orb into the sea, to abandon it completely, as it is and shall forever be a blight and curse. When Hildy prompts her for a more reasonable response, Grund muses with a scoff that the orb could be cleansed, but only if all the remaining aspects, in unanimous accord, poured their power into it and thus rendered it inert and absolved. However, such a happening is laughable at best. The dragons are notorious for maintaining their grudges and grievances, and a full conclave gathering has not happened since the very dawn of creation. Keenly aware of the dragonborn's waning patience, Hildy thanks her for her counsel, and quietly reassures her that while she still views the orb as a tool able to be turned to a good cause, she will never use the orb against her or any of her kind. This vow earns a rare nod of approval and thanks from Grund, and Hildy takes it as an invitation to excuse herself. Intensified by Anderos' inability to magically compel the winds, the Glory's rise drifts listlessly through the breathless, sweltering afternoon. The tiefling, being thoroughly fed up arguing with disagreeable crewmen and an obstinate captain, suddenly finds himself burdened with a keen desire to turn his annoyance upon someone more deserving. Taking up the forecastle, he calls out to Umberlee, demanding to have words with the storm goddess. However, to his surprise, the great queen of the ocean not only responds, but fully manifests upon the bowsprit. Shifting his shock into a surly scowl, the tiefling begins to nettle the goddess over her recent truancy, but she merely concedes to having been quite busy, what with the state of the world blanketed in crimson light under that ominous crescent moon. His bluster temporarily deflected, Anderos demands an explanation, and Umberlee reveals she was responsible for petitioning Saloon not to rewrite him and his companions after they had escaped from the alternate version of Mir she had been writing. Wistfully, the goddess admits she had hoped he would have found happiness, or at least contentment, in a life there in the New World, and laments how quickly he threw the chance away despite its unexplored potential. This news does not sit well with Anderos. Lightning crackles from his eyes as he sharply accuses her of both betraying him and cowardly siding with Saloon and the other gods, but she retorts that the lengthy relationship they have as a celestial family more than trumps the fleeting few decades she has known him. Furthermore, the Void's growing presence in the world represents a greater problem, and ultimately suppressing, or at least hiding its existence from mortals, is and always has been paramount to the world's continued existence, far more than any one mortal life. With a snarl, Anderos accuses her of hypocrisy. It was the gods who first unleashed the Void upon the universe, and his provocation earns the reaction he was seeking. A deafening crack of thunder erupts from the darkening sky, and Umberlee, swelling with her own storm, angrily reminds him it was mortals tampering with the Void that caused Heron's death, and therefore the tenuous state of the world. Anderos, unwilling to back down, asserts while a god's death was lamentable, mortals were never allowed an opinion in their own continued existence, and Umberlee states such is the burden of the gods, not mortals, to carry. Eventually, the goddess offers to entreat Saloon for more time so they might be afforded a chance to find a different solution, and Anderos, with little else but pithy barbs to throw back at her, bites his lip and falls silent. Giving him a sad smile, Umberlee apologizes once more for disappointing him, then sinks back into the sea. Some hours later, in her cabin deep in the hold, a conflicted Hildy decides to take Grund's advice, and proceeds to disentangle her magical energies from the Orb of Dragons. The process proves an arduous ordeal, but after roughly an hour she senses the orb's grip upon her recede. With a sigh of relief, she sets the troublesome artifact aside and prepares to bed down for the night. Suddenly, the room fills with a blaze of golden light, and Hildy cries out in shock, only to fall mute, mouth agape, as there, sitting before her on the cabin's small stool, is a face she has not seen in a long time. The young, red-haired gnome, for indeed it is none other than Lily, Hildy's long-lost bosom companion, greets her with an affable smile and an achingly familiar flirtatious demeanor. But Hildy, instantly recalling the nightmare she witnessed not but a few days prior in Choltmere, demands proof of her existence, even so much as to call her by name. The woman grins wistfully and concedes she's as real as any of her previous apparitions and incarnations. Words catch in Hildy's throat. She stares wide-eyed in shock for a full minute, until Lily gently breaks the silence by stating she's happy to see Hildy seemingly doing well. The admission manages to shake Hildy from her surprise, and she beseeches Lily to reveal what happened in that terrible accident in the Izzet lab all those years ago. However, Lily coyly dubs it her little secret, and instead deflects further questions with a query of her own. If Hildy was given a second chance, an opportunity to save her from the explosion, would she take it? Unprepared for such a heavy question, Hildy slumps back against the cabin wall as countless fragmented thoughts tumble through her mind. Eventually, she blows out a long sigh and admits that past her would have taken the opportunity in a heartbeat. But now, after everything she's been through, the battles she's fought, the knowledge she's uncovered, the deep friendships she's gained, and the growth she's experienced alongside them, she couldn't make that choice so readily anymore. Hearing this, a frown settles on Lily's face, and crossing her arms, she reminds Hildy that they had been like that too, thick as thieves, best friends through hell or high water, and expresses disappointment that she'd throw it all away after just a few short years apart. Hildy stammers, trying desperately to explain herself better, but Lily silences her with a shake of the head and a knowing smile, and proceeds to entreat her to think hard on what has been asked of her, so that in the end she might make the right choice. Choking back a growing lump in her throat, Hildy, though with barely more than a whisper, argues that what is right for the world might be of greater importance, but Lily gently urges her to consider what it is she truly wants. With that, the red-haired gnome vanishes in another flash of golden light, leaving behind only the scorched and smoking sigil of a crescent moon upon the seat of the stool. Staring blankly at where Lily sat mere moments prior, Hildy's stoic resolve finally cracks. Silent, messy tears pour down her face as waves of long-repressed memories and sorrows flood over her, and in a panic she upends the room for something, anything to take the pain away. To her chagrin, neither booze nor her famed narcotics can be found, and in her grief she turns to that which granted her blissful oblivion the night prior, the orb. Seizing the opalescent gem in both hands, she pours her essence back into its well of power, desperate for relief, but instead is granted a vision of some horrifying, esoteric reality of illegible scrawlings upon geometric plinths far beyond the planes of existence, a realm of madness not unlike that of which the warped aspect Von Sin spoke. Thoroughly unnerved, she thrusts the artifact from her grasp and sleeplessly spends the rest of the night curled in a corner of the room, silently weeping from unblinking eyes. Unbeknownst to Hildy, she is not the only one to suffer from sleeplessness that night. Themor, having commandeered the first officer's cabin, prepares for a welcome rest with Von Sin curled happily around the head of his bed. However, as exhaustion begins to overtake him, a familiar chill settles over the room, and in a flash Themor is upright, halberd leveled threateningly at the figure emerging from the shadows. To the lawbringer's surprise, it is not the skeletal form of the lich he was expecting, but instead an old man stooped with age, face creased and sunken with years of worry, and a dull crown resting carelessly on his weathered brow. Gripping the weapon tighter, Themor demands the figure identify himself, but is taken aback when the man merely responds with a soft chuckle, admitting the sight of his strength and vigor brings him great joy. A sudden cough racks the old man's body, but with great effort he regains his composure, and Themor stoically demands again his name. With a weak, affectionate smile, the wizened man claims to be Soros, but not he whom Themor had met in the crypts, but rather a specter of his former self, king and emperor of Drayt, and a heartbroken father unable to help his ailing son. Sitting unmoved, Themor asserts he will not be deceived again by the lich's half-truths and manipulations, and Soros concedes his mistrust is not unexpected, though misplaced for now. The old man then recounts how his beloved wife had died in childbirth, and how the resulting son was stricken with an incurable sickness. As king of a nation teeming with powerful sorcerers and unmatched artifice, he had sought every possible avenue for a cure, magics both arcane and divine, prayers to every deity who would listen, and even desperate pleas to the great dragons themselves. But all had been for naught. The boy's fate and destiny, according to the high clerics, the magisters, and even the celestial servants of the gods, was to die. So out of mounting desperation, Soros chose instead to sacrifice everything he was, everything he had, in order to save his son. As Soros completes his tale, Themor lets out a skeptical grunt, and reminds the old man how callous and subservient he had been treated when last they met, deep below the ruins of Drayt. Not only had Soros lambasted him for treachery and defiance, but the lich had also constructed a weapon for which his soul was meant to be siphoned and used as the power catalyst to destroy the gods. A frown spreads once more over the old man's face, and he sadly admits the man, nay, the skeletal, unfeeling abomination he became, was the unfortunate result of the sacrifices needed in order to save him, his son, from his inevitable fate. Unconvinced, Themor's only response is to keep his halberd stoically trained on his supposed father, and the old man blows out a disappointed sigh and melts back into the shadows, leaving a glimmering crescent moon emblazoned on the floor where he once stood. With the apparition having finally departed, Themor slumps back on the bed, but sleep eludes the mighty warrior as an endless flood of thoughts and questions plague his mind. The next morning, plagued by thoughts and suspicions, Themor decides to pay Hildy a visit regarding the orb she had discussed with Grund the day before. The diminutive tinkerer, also suffering from sleeplessness, had managed to discover a more constructive outlet for dealing with her inner demons, immersing herself fully into a new and engaging research study. Thus, when Themor receives no answer after knocking on her door, he opts to let himself in, only to find Hildy elbow deep in the head of the inert automaton keeper, intent on gleaning whatever information it might still contain. His unannounced presence, combined with her already frazzled nerves, earns a startled shriek from the gnome, but thankfully Hildy is able to regain her composure without any reckless pyrotechnics. Giving her a curt nod, Themor requests to inspect the Orb of Dragons, but is quickly rebuffed as Hildy claims it to be both incredibly powerful and dangerous. The Lawbringer, as always, declares his magic is far superior, but explains he merely wishes to study it and would be happy to do so here in her presence should she demand it. This sensible argument eventually earns a nod of approval from Hildy, and she proceeds to hand the orb to Themor. Or rather, attempts to do so, but finds her limbs unwilling to relinquish the insidious artifact, instead pulling the orb closer rather than extending it to her companion. Confused at this response, Themor steps forward and physically grabs hold of the orb in an attempt to lift it from her grasp. A short wrestling bout ensues, but as expected, Themor's overwhelming strength proves greater than that of the gnome, and with a mighty tug he wrenches it from Hildy's grasp. A sudden blast of psychic energy cascades over Hildy as her magical connection to the orb is forcibly severed, and she screams out in pain and falls to the deck. To his credit, Themor is quick to help her back to her feet, but when she reveals something insidious lashed out at her when he pulled the orb away, he blithely admits he heard and experienced nothing. Rolling her eyes and blowing out an annoyed chuff, Hildy gathers up her scattered tools and returns her attention to the automaton's brain, and Themor likewise plants himself on the nearest stool, sets the orb on his lap, and quietly keeps her company as she works. While the others busy themselves with cursed artifacts, disconcerting visions, or the general duties of sailing, the halfling paladin Amos chooses instead to sequester himself below decks in the stern cabin, focusing his efforts on prayer and meditation in hopes of receiving further guidance from his god Lathander. These acts of piety, however, do not garner the attention of the Dawn Lord as intended, but rather those of the flamboyantly garbed Tyrone, having stowed away to maintain proximity with the hero so closely linked to the gods who refuse to acknowledge him. Unsurprisingly, the gnome's anxious attempts at eavesdropping catch Amos's attention sometime during the first day, but he pays the voyeur little mind initially. After enduring nightmares and sleeplessness, however, the paladin, being suspicious of the gnome's identity and purpose upon the ship, decides to confront the peeping Tom. Dressed in only a simple habit, having left his armor and armaments behind in the other room, Amos pads over to the small mess hall to find the gnome cowering amidst a hastily erected amalgamation of shrines in the corner of the room. Setting aside his confusion, Amos introduces himself and inquires about the gnome's eclectic decorations, but Tyrone ignores the paladin's question and instead demands to know if he, with all his prayers and piety, is privy to the voice of the gods. Amos shakes his head sadly and admits, while he is a devout follower of the Dawn Lord Lathander, he has never once heard his voice, much to his own shame and consternation. This draws a frown from Tyrone, as he had hoped someone with such visible faith would have been able to help him with this particularly vexing problem, and as such slumps to the floor in disappointment. Seeing a man in the throes of desperation, Amos commiserates as one with whom the gods also refuse to speak, and offers to share his story in hopes it might provide some comfort and advice. Taking Tyrone's silence as an invitation, Amos recounts his journey to becoming a paladin in order to protect his village. Some years ago, he was just a mere potato farmer, living quietly in a small farming village of Silver Sage in central Whiteleaf. Times were prosperous and peaceful, there was growing concern with the kingdom's push toward militant expansionism, and Amos believes that someday soon he might be called upon to defend his village and loved ones. Fortuitously, an esteemed order of altruistic paladins, led by a man named Randul, visited their village seeking recruits. Much to Amos's relief, the Order was not affiliated with Sunbreak or the White Order, and as such, Amos volunteered. He proved to be a diligent study of both spellcraft and piety, but success in the trial of combat always eluded him. Try as he might, he could not best the combat instructor, Hadron Rashan of Sunbreak, leaving his hopes of joining the Order all but extinguished. Disappointment turned to frustration, and his prayers to Lathander became seeped in bitterness and anger as he saw his chance of gaining enough power to defend those he loved slipping away from him. That night, however, an answer did come, though not as a vision or a deific epiphany. As Amos prayed, a great flash of golden light careened across the night sky and plummeted into one of the nearby fields with a mighty, thunderous crash. Throwing on his coat and boots, Amos rushed out to find the bloodied, broken form of an angel in a deep crater surrounded by unearthed potatoes. To his relief, the Celestial still clung to life, and Amos, after carefully carting him to his home, spent the next few weeks nursing him back to health. This angel, calling himself Aremiel, offered to grant Amos a boon in thanks for his great service and hospitality, and the humble potato farmer did not hesitate to ask for aid in passing the combat trial of the paladins. Glowing with golden light, Aremiel bestowed upon him the gift of martial prowess by means of summoning celestial weaponry, and soon Amos was admitted into the Order as a full member. For the next year, a buoyant Amos trained as a paladin and grew his skills under Randul, but when the armies of the White Order marched southward from Sunbreak to conquer the continent under Saloon's banner, the lowly village of Silversage was callously overrun. Fleeing for their lives, Amos sent his wife and children with a band of refugees making for Galaran, then headed south after Randul in hopes he might return and help retake his lost village. As Amos concluded his lengthy story, he looks up to see Tyrone staring at him, his face a mask of confusion and frustration. Finding his voice, the gnome asks how such a story, one where the gods literally sent him an angelic messenger, should be of any comfort to him, to whom the gods refused to speak or acknowledge despite his years of striving. Unflustered, Amos argues that his answer came not from the gods, but was merely the due rewards of his journey of faith, not unlike the great growth of a potato plant from its minuscule and unremarkable seed. With a weary sigh, Tyrone inquires if there is someone else upon the ship with a more tangible connection to the gods with whom he could speak, but when Amos mentions Seabreeze was recently graced with a theophany of Lathander, the gnome visibly blanches and demands Amos to leave him in peace. Bemused at this reaction, the paladin reassures him that his journey of faith may look different than others, and heads back to his own room to resume his prayers. As his eyes close in reverent supplication, however, a vision of the words God Killer, God Betrayer flashes in fiery script before his eyes, leaving him only further perplexed by his strange new companion. Some hours later, a weary Anderos retreats to the stern quarterdeck for a moment of solitude. Thoughts of his earlier conversation with Umberlee still roil about in his head, but one particular topic, the void, reminds him that he has yet to hear from Madeline regarding the bargain they had struck after he had saved Absconded's life from Seabreeze's blades. Reaching into his satchel, he grabs the small stone he had designated to be their link for future conversations, and a moment later, violet runes, pulsing with the chill of the void, begin to creep up his arm. Right on cue, Madeline's haughty chuckle echoes in his mind, and he whirls around to see her perched atop the stern gunwale, a teasing grin dancing on her pale lips. Foregoing any sort of introductory banter, Anderos demands a report of her findings, both of Marani and of how to traverse the plains in order to retrieve her. Madeline pouts a bit at the tiefling's brusque temper, but eventually divulges she has indeed found his lost companion, but her situation is both precarious and problematic. Due to her connections with both the material and astral planes, Marani currently resides within a pocket dimension of the void, something not unlike a stitch between planes. However, Attempting to extract her by normal arcane means could potentially unmake one or both the planes she is trapped between, and as such, she is well and truly beyond their reach. Frowning at this news, Anderos suggests that a demigoddess of the void, as she claims to be, should have little trouble bypassing such an inconsequential obstacle. But Madeline states even Saloon, despite being the one who fashioned Morani's cage, would likely find disentangling mortal from stitch a fraught task. As Anderos tries to protest, however, Madeline flashes him a teasing grin and claims she could at least aid in breaching the planar barrier safely, but only if Anderos would bind himself to her as a conduit of the void. Lightning crackles from Anderos' eyes as he snarls a rebuttal of colorful expletives, and with a sardonic chuckle she fades from view, admitting as a final retort that when Saloon unmakes him, she will at least miss his fire.